So we all know the UFC has their preparations when it comes to their champions and who they want at the top of the sport. Now, sometimes when you see the UFC kind of coddle some fighters and kind of give them a nice sort of great pathway towards getting that UFC championship belt, sometimes they make some fighters have a very hard and difficult pathway. But what if the UFC could always get what they want, which they kind of already do? But let's say we live in a world where they could openly do it and no one could do a damn thing about it. Who would the UFC in every single weight class make champion if they could get away with it? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through every single weight class here and give you the UFC's preferred champion. Who would make them the most amount of money? Who would bring in the most pay-per-view buys? Who would sell the most tickets? Who would do the best in the interviews? All of that mumbo jumbo. Damn, I said that. But who would the UFC make champion if they could? Now, starting off with the flyweight division, I actually don't think the UFC has any sort of preferred guy who they would want to be champion. If you asked me a few months ago, or maybe even sometime last year, I would probably say Kai Sakura making his debut. They want to branch out to the Japanese market and get a guy that can kind of open the well for them into getting to that Eastern Hemisphere or that sort of Japanese Asian sort of market. So with Kai Sakura losing to Pantoja, probably now it still is Pantoja. Maybe they can get behind him and push that sort of he's a GOAT of flyweight division sort of status. Maybe they can push a narrative that says, oh, he would have beaten DJ. Like, there are several things the UFC can do to get behind Pantoja, and he still kind of produces some fun fights here and there. So Pantoja probably fits the bill for what the UFC want in the future for the flyweight division. It still kind of is a division where the UFC kind of puts it in the back burner, kind of ignores it. Maybe you could argue Manel Cap as well. I just remembered that. But Pantoja overall is kind of the guy the UFC, I think, wants to stay with right now. Obviously, again, Manel Cap, you could put him into that argument. Maybe he could, have some fun interviews, some fun press conference moments. But other than that, I don't really know what the UFC could do at flyweight besides sticking with Pantoja. Now, with bantamweight, I think this one is very clear and very obvious. It definitely still is Sean O'Malley. With him possibly getting a rematch versus Merab, that pretty much tells you all you need to know. They want O'Malley at the top. He is their star boy. He is their golden boy. At one point when he was the champion, they wanted him to go on to do big things. Even in his upbringing in the UFC, on his path to the title, they were somewhat babying him until he fought Petr Yan. This guy was not fighting anybody really relevant. That was a tough matchup until the Petr Yan fight. I even think at the time he was ranked at number 11 while Petr Yan was ranked number 3. So they were giving him a really big jump up. They were putting pretty much all of their chips on the table for him to become champion in that matchup versus Petr Yan. And he did. He won, kind of arguably a robbery with that matchup. But O'Malley is that kind of guy who does big numbers on Instagram, who does big numbers on any social media that you see him on. His personality sometimes can be a bit bland and a bit boring. But overall, O'Malley was that kind of guy who the little kids resonated with, who all of the little teenagers wanted to be champion, who recognized him from his 6ix9ine tattoo on that one Instagram video or that one TikTok. Like, O'Malley was their guy to sell pay-per-views at one point, and he kind of still is, but I think now they might have cooled off on him post the Merab loss. But still, I think when it comes down to him and Merab, they definitely want O'Malley being the one holding the championship belt for the future. So O'Malley is still your guy. It is what it is. And now for featherweight and kind of lightweight, it is Ilia Topuria. Now, I think the UFC kind of had a nice little wrench thrown into their plans with Ilia Topuria. I think they realistically wanted him to stay featherweight champion and move up to lightweight to fight Islam and then beat Islam, because Topuria right now, I would say, is one of the hottest names in the sport, if not the hottest name in the sport. And him reaching double champ status would just kind of very much elevate him as a star for the sport and what he could do for the future. This guy is not shy of talking trash. This guy pretty much with every single fight puts everything on the line. If you ever watch an Ilia Topuria interview, he is pretty much going for broke. He is saying he's going to KO this guy. He is leaving himself to either look like a complete Chad and just live up to what he's saying, or get absolutely embarrassed and be on a bunch of TikTok clips with him saying, oh, I'm going to KO this guy, and then him getting flatlined. So Topuria is that kind of guy with the style that he has and the KOs and finishes that he gets. He is the guy that's always going to put on a good pay-per-view main event with the way he fights and the possibility of him getting a KO. And obviously with the aura that he brings to the table, it just makes things that much sweeter. Now, I think the idea of the UFC, now this is just me purely speculating. This is not rooted in any sort of news or any sort of, I guess, evidence per se. But I think the plan for Ilia Topuria was for him to move up to lightweight and beat Islam, achieve that double champ status. And I think on the back burner, I think they were secretly rooting for Paddy Pimblett, because if you don't know, Ilia Topuria and Paddy Pimblett have a very nice, rich history of beef, of solid beef. And I think what they wanted is a huge potential matchup where they kind of coddle Paddy Pimblett in the background, give him some nice matchups, maybe even jumpstart him to get a title shot versus Ilia Topuria if he did beat Islam, and then have that fight be absolutely massive. Because as we know, Paddy Pimblett is a massive name in the UK. He's a massive name just overall, and him versus Topuria, it would be a lot of trash talk, a lot of shit talk, and overall that fight would just sell. You couldn't tell me that Topuria versus Paddy Pimblett wouldn't sell. I think that was their plan in the background. I think they wanted Topuria to move up and then fight Paddy Pimblett at some point. Now, if Paddy does even get that far, it is left to, whatever the UFC does with him and if he can still continue to win. But I think just overall, the UFC kind of had a nice plan for Topuria, for him to have even bigger fights in the future at lightweight and at featherweight. But honestly, I think the UFC is still kind of fine with Islam being their champion. Obviously, he brings that market, that Dagestani market. He just is dominant. The UFC is always looking towards finding that next guy who can be the GOAT of their division. I think obviously Islam is that guy. So they don't mind Islam being champion. Like I do think if Islam versus Topuria happens, I don't think they necessarily care who wins that matchup. It's going to be a great fight no matter what. But if Islam wins, the UFC is not going to be like, oh, wow, I can't believe Islam won. Like, everything's bullshit. This is all stupid. But I do think if the UFC had their preferred choice between Topuria and Islam, I think they would go with Ilia Topuria. Now, moving on to welterweight, this one I would also say is pretty murky. It's pretty, it's hard to really tell who they would actually want to be champion. I put Shavkat. Now, Shavkat can be debatable now. I think the UFC is fine with Shavkat being champion. Honestly, at this point, I think the UFC is fine with anybody besides Bilal being champion at welterweight. It's just that Bilal isn't going to produce really much for the UFC in terms of business, in terms of pay-per-view buys and sales. And I think when they look at Shavkat, I think that is a kind of fighter who they think can produce something in the future for them. Now, JDM is also that kind of guy, but JDM is just so bland and boring on the microphone that it does make it pretty tough. Like, I love JDM. He is my favorite fighter in the UFC, but he doesn't ever really produce anything that is too entertaining besides his fights. The only thing that JDM does that's fun to watch is his fights. His personality is just very simple. It's very boring. So the UFC, I think when it comes to welterweight, they look at it as, you know what? Anybody besides Bilal, they can have fun fights. They can have, fun matchups in the future, fun speculation to what they can do in the future. I think Shavkat is fine. I think JDM is fine, which is why I think they kind of made JDM get the next shot. Obviously, Shavkat couldn't do it. So the second guy up, I think, is JDM. Now, for middleweight, I do have two fighters for this. I do have Adesanya and Chimaev. Now, for Adesanya first, this one's pretty obvious. Adesanya was that former champion who had a very big fan base, who a lot of people loved. I would say kind of a toxic fan base, if I'm being honest with you, but nevertheless, a very big, huge fan base. And just, they want to get behind that sort of narrative again. Like, if Adesanya can make a comeback again, make a run for his last championship belt and win it, I think that would be amazing for him. Obviously, it would be a big pay-per-view versus whoever he fights, because it is just Israel Adesanya. Just marketing-wise, Adesanya is their guy. Pretty simple. Now, Chimaev, same sort of deal. But the only problem with Chimaev is that he cannot fight in the USA. Now, Chimaev in himself, as a fighter, as a personality, does fit the bill for the UFC. He's part of that Eastern market, the Eastern Hemisphere market. He's Chimaev. He does have some sort of Western personality to him. He dominates the majority of everybody he fights. His style is very fast and fun to watch. People just love Chimaev overall. Just the fact that he can't fight in the USA does throw a big wrench in the UFC's plans with him. They can't put on a huge fight, in LA or Vegas or New York because Chimaev probably can't fight there. So that's an issue for them. But if they could just make him champion and he could fight anywhere he wanted, Chimaev would probably be the guy over Adesanya right now, since Adesanya has been losing. But Chimaev, I think, definitely is their guy if he does, get a fight versus Du Plessis in the future, which I think he probably will. But moving on to light heavyweight, again, this one, pretty obvious though for a video idea, I guess, now that I'm thinking about it or doing this video now. But for light heavyweight, it is Alex Pereira. Obvious, clear cut. I can give you a bunch of reasonings. I'll give you some. But Alex Pereira is their moneymaker. He is their savior. He has done so many favors for the UFC, saving UFC 300, fighting Khalil Roundtree for an event. Overall, his fight style, his name, his marketing value, Shama is a huge thing. People love Alex Pereira. He just is that fighter who you want to watch every card, has spectacular performances, has very fun fights, good finishes. Overall, he just is their dude. He was their dude until he lost to Magomed Ankalaev. So if they ever do rebook the Ankalaev-Pereira matchup, which I think they will, they're definitely 100% rooting for Pereira. I think Pereira will obviously sell more than Magomed Ankalaev will ever sell in his career. I think one pay-per-view from Alex Pereira will sell more than whatever Ankalaev does sell in the future, unless they obviously stack an Ankalaev card to absolute oblivion. But overall, Pereira is just going to just do way more things for the UFC in terms of name value, in terms of marketing, in terms of sales, in terms of just, social media clicks. He will do way more than what Ankalaev will do. So if the UFC could put that belt back on to Alex Pereira, they would do it probably in a heartbeat. Obviously, what we saw Dana White's face after he had to put the belt on Ankalaev, he was not happy with Ankalaev winning. It sucks for the UFC because they just wanted Pereira to just be amazing, and they kind of had to give him Ankalaev because there really wasn't anybody else. And this fight between those two was the biggest fight for Pereira. This was his toughest challenge, and he lost. So it was his toughest challenge, and he did lose. So yeah, Pereira at number 7 or at light heavyweight, I just don't think that the UFC would want anybody else besides Pereira. They wouldn't mind a Yuri or a Jamal Hill, but I think if they had to come down to it, if there was a gun to their head and they're saying, hey, you got to pick between Alex Pereira, Jamal Hill, and Yuri Prochazka to be your light heavyweight champion, they're probably 100%, with no hesitation, picking Alex Pereira. Now, for the heavyweight division, here is my sort of take with this. They want Jon Jones to stay champion, and they want him to remain champion until he retires. And I think this is kind of why they want to avoid him versus Tom Aspinall, or why they're not forcing Jon Jones to fight Tom Aspinall. Because at this point, if Jon Jones was anybody else in the UFC, he would have been stripped, and it would have been Tom Aspinall versus anybody else for that heavyweight belt right now. But since it's Jon Jones, they need, or they desperately want, Jon Jones to exit the sport being the GOAT. They want him to be talked about for the next 20 years, 30 years. They want him to be the Michael Jordan of the UFC. And so with Tom Aspinall being the up-and-coming guy who has a real legitimate threat of beating Jon Jones, who possibly could put him out, that, I think, puts a ton of fear into the UFC. And they kind of are okay. They want the Jon Jones Aspinall matchup. They want to make that happen, but they're kind of content with it not happening and having Jon Jones just step away and retiring. Because again, like I said before, if they weren't okay with that, Jon Jones would have been stripped by now. So Jon Jones, they still want to be champion, but as soon as Jon Jones exits the sport, as soon as he retires, they're going to put everything in the Tom Aspinall. Tom Aspinall is going to be their golden boy. They're going to do everything they can for Tom Aspinall to be this next heavyweight GOAT, who can always have that narrative as that, oh, maybe he would have beaten Jon Jones. They can always promote him as the guy who could have beaten Jon Jones, who maybe would have beaten Jon Jones. And that, I think, goes a long way. It also kind of helps the division, because I think the worst fear for the UFC right now is if Jon Jones does beat Tom Aspinall, then Jon Jones retires and Tom Aspinall becomes the undisputed champion. That kind of sort of sullies Tom Aspinall as a champion and makes him look lesser. So I think they either need Tom Aspinall to win, which does suck for the, their whole GOAT narrative, or they pretty much never let that fight happen in the first place. They kind of give Jon Jones what he wants, and maybe he wants Pereira, maybe he wants a Derek Lewis, like he called out one time. There really isn't. There's just too many negatives for Jon Jones beating Aspinall and then retiring, and there's more positives and Tom Aspinall beating John Jones and or just not having the fight in general. So I think the UFC right now, they prefer John Jones to be their champion until he retires, and then it's going to be all the chips on the Tom Aspinall. So yeah, that's pretty much it. If the UFC could pick any champion they wanted, I think these, I guess 10 guys maybe would be the guys for the UFC. If you enjoyed this video, like button, subscribe button, bell icon for notifications, but I'll see y'all later. Peace.